All right, if everyone can take their seats, we're going to begin. I am Rachel Gottlieb, and I am chairing our session this afternoon. So it's Block C, and we are in Strand 1, Subjects and Their Objects. And in particular, we're looking at mediated objects, material objects, and creative processes. So our first speaker today is Samantha Burton, and Samantha holds a SSHRC postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Fine Art History and the Visual Studies Research Institute at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. She completed her PhD at McGill and is currently working on a book manuscript about Canadian women artists who lived and worked in Britain in the decades prior to the World War I. Research relating to this project has been published in venues that include the Journal of Canadian Art History and the edited collection of Women, Femininity, and Public Space in the European Visual Culture. She's also currently working on a postdoctoral project that takes up the subject of Victorian plant conservatory in Britain, North America, and the British Caribbean. An essay based on the initial research for this project, which puts French artist James Tissot's representation of his London conservatory in dialogue with the scientific discourses about sex, race, health, and climate theory, will appear in the upcoming issue of Victorian Studies. So it all sounds extremely fascinating. What a great research legacy and publishing legacy you have to date, Samantha. And today, this afternoon, she's going to be talking about illustrating the in-between. Emily Carr, Self-Portraiture, and the 19th-century travel picture. So just to remind everyone that the format is the same as this morning, a 20-minute talk, and then we'll take questions for 10 minutes following the talk. So please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming in. I will try to keep things lively in the post-lunch slump. This is your obligatory paper on Emily Carr. First, I just want to note that I do have a slight title change, so my talk today will be called Illustrating the In-Between, Self-Portraiture in Emily Carr's Early Illustrated Travel Books. My own ego also forces me to point out that any spelling and punctuation errors you're going to see in the text are the product of Carr's own, shall we say, idiosyncratic writing style. They're not my own. One afternoon in 1903 found Emily Carr alone in her room gazing at a potted orchid. Though a tremendously dignified, regal bloom that impelled its viewers to reverence, she wrote, the flower also struck her as aloof, like a stranger in a crowd whose language he does not understand. Kept in a place of honor amongst her other plants and flowers, she reflected that others also noted the orchid's queerness. The orchid's home was Carr's room in the East Anglia Sanatorium near Colchester, just northeast of London, England. The other admirers, her doctors, nurses, and fellow patients. The artist entered the institution in January 1903, where she was treated for an illness that has variously been called hysteria, neurasthenia, nervous breakdown, and clinical depression. Carr herself attributed it to too much hard work. She remained in recovery for 18 months before returning home to Canada without saying goodbye to her friends and colleagues. In this manner did a half-decade in Britain and significant but little studied phase of Carr's otherwise very well-documented career end. Published posthumously in a short illustrated volume called Paws, the artist's ambivalent account of the orchid that brightened her sanatorium room functions as a portrait of the unstable identity she keenly felt as a Canadian living in Britain, a colonial woman out of place in the heart of empire. This paper examines Carr's use of illustration, arguably a marginal medium, to negotiate her own marginal identity in what is now seen as a marginal time in her career. And Paws is just one of several examples by the artist to come to terms with this decentered identity produced by her travel through the pairing of text and image. And you're just seeing a few examples up here. In fact, the artist produced several illustrated books that dealt with similar themes between 1895 and 1910. And I'll note right up front here that I'm going to be calling them illustrated books throughout this talk and talking a lot about illustration, but I'm not actually totally sure that this is the best label for them. So I would be very happy to talk about alternatives or other suggestions you might have during the Q&A period. Carr herself called them her funny books. I argue that these early books individually and collectively constitute a kind of self-portraiture. They clearly show the artist grappling with questions of her own gender, class, professional status, nationality, and sense of imperial belonging while she was living abroad. Furthermore, and this will be my focus here today, a consideration of the books places the genre of self-portraiture in conversation with formal considerations of medium. So my big question here today is, why did Carr look to illustration specifically as a tool for self-representation in this period? Looking at the visual and material characteristics of the books themselves and at the dynamic reading and viewing strategies they demand, particularly through the motif of repetition that I'll talk about, I hope to show that illustration constituted a particularly effective form of self-portraiture for a traveling artist attempting to understand and represent her shifting place in the world. Emily Carr's story has been told ably elsewhere, possibly even by people in this room, so I am not going to rehearse it here. What I will say is simply that the existing popular narrative of the artist's life and work, which links the artist firmly to Canada and to British Columbia specifically, rarely includes the first two much more cosmopolitan decades of her career. Convinced by visiting artists who called the Pacific Northwest crude and unpaintable, and who claimed a European art education was a professional necessity, Emily Carr, in fact, left Canada to enroll in London's Westminster School of Art in 1899. In the 5.5 years she lived in Britain, she also worked for significant periods of time in Cornwall and Hertfordshire. This was neither her first nor last major trip away from Canada. Her time in Britain was preceded by 3 years' study in San Francisco in 1890 to 93. It was followed by a lengthy trip up the Alaskan coast in 1907, and finally by a year in France in 1910-1911. Admittedly, no doubt some of the lack of attention to Carr's early career stems from the lack of paintings from that period. What few paintings do exist from her San Francisco and London years show a traditional academic art education and little of the subject or style that would gain her later fame. But throughout these busy years, the artist did create a number of illustrated books, all largely untouched in the otherwise extensive scholarship on Carr. Although they each differ somewhat in appearance, the books all present a series of simple, often humorous drawings that are augmented by poems, diary entries, and other written reflections. Some of the books are narrative, telling a single story over the course of the book. Others present a kind of series of vignettes on a theme. So these books include, and I just want to take some time to show you them because most of these have never been published. These include London Student Sojourn, which is a relatively large bound set of 21 watercolors, each of them accompanied by a short poem that has been pasted in beside it. This book provides an account of Carr's stay in a crowded London boarding house. Next, we have The Queen's Funeral, which is a short series of only 7 illustrations. This one tells the story of Carr and a friend going to see Queen Victoria, or I should say trying to go see Queen Victoria's funeral procession in 1901. This is the Olsen Student. This one was also produced while Carr was in England. This is a rhyming series of 7 illustrations and poems about her experience being a poor art student in the rural art colony of St. Ives in Cornwall. Jumping ahead a few years, we have the Alaska Journal, which traces her trip to Alaska with her sister Alice in 1907. This one is sadly now lost, except for a few sheets. But we can get a sense of what it might have looked like by looking at her final illustrated book, Sister and I from Victoria to London, which chronicles her travel in the same format, again with Alice across Canada and the Atlantic on her way to Paris via London in 1910. So both of these, the Alaska Journal and Sister and I, are a set of pen and ink drawings with accompanying diary entries. And then finally, returning to where this paper began, we have Paws, which itself has somewhat of a more complicated history. So the Paws that was published in 1953, and it's the only one of these early books to be published as a standalone text, combines a set of stories about her time in the sanatorium, written in the years immediately before her death in 1945. So it combines these writings with the sketchbook that the artist actually kept while she was in the sanatorium in 1903-04. And that sketchbook itself is made up of pictures, poetry, prose, and various sketches. However, what interests me is the fact that this sketchbook was also the source for its own finished illustrated book in the manner of the others. In her autobiography, Growing Pains, she records that after it was released, she worked for 2 weeks on what she called a satire of her time there, which she describes as a self-bound series of 30 color sketches, all accompanied by long verses. Presumably, it would have looked similar to the other books from her London period. But unfortunately, although we still have the original sketchbook, this finished product has been lost. So in virtually the only scholarly essay that deals with these books in depth, art historian Joanne Lamoureux has called Carr's early illustrations autobiographical caricatures, and argues that together these images form an unvarnished picture of the artist. And that's a quote. It is certainly true that the books present a much different version of Carr's early years than that found in her later published writings. London Student Sojourn, of which you're seeing an example here, and the Olsen Student, for example, present her time in England not as the lonely and oppressive period she recounts in Growing Pains, but as a time of close friendship and excitement about school and work. Likewise, the Alaska Journal and Sister and I both show the Carr sisters as not as intrepid solo adventurers tramping through the bush, but as tourists emphatically on the beaten track. And I chose this one in particular because it especially spoke to me after the 6.5-hour long plane ride it took me to get here with the babies crying. And I just like this one because it's like kind of the more things change kind of image, I think, when it comes to travel. That said, I am not sure that we should see these as private, unmediated glimpses at the artist. Indeed, it seems that Carr intended to give at least some of these books as gifts. The Alaska Journal was given to her sister and traveling partner Alice, for example, and the original final version of Paws was mailed to her doctors at the sanatorium. The recently discovered Queen's Funeral was given to her friend and roommate Hannah Kendall, who features prominently as a character in both that book and in London Student Sojourn. Moreover, there are, in fact, 2 nearly identical versions of this book. So the fact that these were both given to others and produced in multiple copies suggests the possibility that the books reflect not so much unvarnished diary-like sketches of the artist's life, but but a deliberate working through and public staging of self-identity. So how then does Carr choose to represent herself? Notably, like her story of the orchid, all of the books are accounts of moments in the artist's life when she felt her identity to be shifting and in process. As a foreigner in Britain, a student among wealthy colleagues, a woman traveling, and a patient in a sanatorium. The sites she represents are not the eternal forests of the Pacific Northwest for which she would later become known, but transitional in-between spaces, hospitals, boarding houses, hotels, ships. So why then, my question becomes, did Carr turn to the illustrated book, a format she abandoned after returning to Canada permanently in 1911? Why did she turn to the illustrated book to record and negotiate this experience of her travel? And how did the books themselves materially register that travel and the decentered identity it produced? Now, I suggested earlier that I have some trouble with the term illustrated books for these objects. They seem considerably more polished than diaries, journals, or sketchbooks. The Alaska Journal and Sister and I from Victoria to London are good examples here. While many of the entries are dated as though they were journals kept while on the road, the pages have clearly been edited and carefully laid out after the fact. The end result of these diaries, or so-called diaries, is very different, is visually very different than, for example, the sketchbook she kept while in the sanatorium. And yet somehow illustrated books seems too formal. They were, after all, unpublished and only made in small quantities, presumably only meant for a very private audience. Moreover, the traditional implications of illustration as a commercial practice associated with mass reproduction seems to conflict with the small-scale homemade nature of the objects. Now, I should note here too, though, that there is some evidence that in fact Carr went to San Francisco and London with the specific goal of becoming a commercial illustrator, and also the fact that the artist worked as a commercial political cartoonist when she returned home to Victoria. So these possibilities, I think, add a kind of additional layer of complexity to efforts to situate these books in the greater context of Carr's oeuvre, and again suggest an interpretation that departs from seeing them simply as the personal diary-like sketches of a young artist still far from her prime. And I'll remind you here that at least one of these books was produced in multiple copies, and you can kind of get a sense of their similarities and differences here. Ultimately, though, the reason that I have settled on illustrated books is because of its turn of the century implications of process and dialogue. In Joseph Pinnell's popular manual, The Illustration of Books, published in 1896, and therefore something that Carr would potentially have been reading while she was in London, the illustrated book is described as a kind of multimedia art form, a fundamentally collaborative and constructive medium. An illustration, after all, needs to be illustrating something else. It needs to have that outside referent. This combination of text and image, especially when placed in series, as in a book, demands a dynamic reading and viewing process. So this is perhaps most apparent in the constructive strategy of repetition that Carr uses in her books. And this is especially obvious in the Olsen Student, which you're seeing here. What we're looking at here is the artist representing herself over and over again, always in the same setting, always in the woods, always from behind, always enclosed in this relatively small frame, and always next to a short cumulative poem that she has pasted in on the side. From frame to frame, it will probably be hard to see in the PowerPoint here, she adds different elements to the basic image: a cloak, a clock, an umbrella. This visual repetition, tied to the repetition of the text, is a comedic device, yes, but it also effectively demands that the audience actively participate in building a kind of self-portrait of Carr over the course of their reading. And this repetition is also evident in the other books, through, for instance, a persistent umbrella throughout Sister and I, or the framing device of the curtains that we see in London Student Sojourn. These motifs tie each series of images and text together, giving them a consistent internal logic and structure, while encouraging the viewer to understand that identity is something in process, something to be constructed, rather than a static, unchanging, essential state. And it is with this understanding of illustration that I believe the most fruitful links between medium and subject in the Carr books can be made. I propose that these viewing demands replicate the way in which Carr understood her own identity in the early period abroad, as dynamic and in process. On the one hand, travel has always been understood as a search for self-identity, colonial travel to the heart of empire, especially so. For colonial tourists, travel to Britain was about more than just the pleasures of sightseeing. It also enticingly offered the possibility of locating one's ancestral roots, and as one tourist guidebook advertised, of being among a kindred people. The practice of this travel was furthermore itself conceived of as being repetitive in some sense. Travel is always already prescribed to a certain extent, with routes and destinations planned ahead of time according to suggestions from advertising, guidebooks, other forms of visual culture. And personal experiences, personal responses are mediated through the experiences of the thousands who have gone before. So there's a kind of cycle of repetition going on in this kind of colonial tourism. And certainly Carr's own writing shows that the artist felt this acutely. Her disappointment that England failed to live up to expectations pervades her own account of her time abroad in Growing Pains. On the other hand, travel has also frequently been positioned as a kind of destabilizing force for identity construction. Canadian women soon found that they were not always welcomed among these kindred people, and they could not find themselves there. They found themselves instead dismissed by their English peers as uncivilized or colonial, labels that forced them to rethink their own and Canada's place and identity within the greater British Empire. This plays out first and foremost in Carr's travel books through an insistent, repetitive representation of her own awkward body and an almost obsessive anxiety about clothing and appearance, and this goes across her travel books. The liminal experience of travel then clearly provided the opportunity for Emily Carr to think through traditional ideas about the performance of gender, class, and nationality in this context, and I believe the medium of illustration provided her the tools with which to do so. Now, I would like to conclude with just a few final notes to suggest some future directions for this research, which I will admit is still in its very early stages. First, travel and illustration have long been linked. You need only think of the mountains of research done on early modern illustrated travel narratives, for example. So in this respect, Carr's work belongs to a much longer visual tradition and deserves to be looked at in this wider context. Second, I think I can't end this paper without saying a little something about the simple practicality of the medium for an artist who is traveling, and the portability of the material objects themselves. And here again, the best example is the Queen's funeral, which we know now was given, or one version of it, was given to Carr by her, or given by Carr to her best friend in England, whose niece then moved with it to Zimbabwe, then colonial Rhodesia. By the time the book found its way into the Royal BC Archives in 2012, it had itself undertaken its own colonial travel itinerary. And finally, both travel and illustration provide a lens through which we might begin to rethink Emily Carr's place as the First Lady of Canadian art, especially if we see each of these practices, travel and illustration, in relation to questions of self-portraiture and identity construction. Carr would only rarely return to self-portraiture as a genre in the later decades of her career. Examination of the ways in which these early illustrated books negotiated the flexible identity of a woman traveling, living in between in hotels, boarding rooms, and hospitals, not only complicates the long-standing modernist legend of Carr as an individual genius, exceptional woman, and quintessential Canadian, but contributes to feminist and post-colonial interventions in the study of self-representation more generally. Thank you.